Well, I'm so glad to see all you hardy, brave souls that came out in this weather that we've had. It's clear, but it's awfully cold, and the roads are still pretty crappy, you know. So, but thank you for making time to get here. It's really great to have you. And this is going to be a very, very interesting program. I'm John Hamry, and I'm playing only an ornamental role here, and that is to welcome all of you and to say a sincere thank you to Senator Cantwell and Senator Young for joining us today. You're both Hoosiers, as I understand. I mean, I'm originally Hoosier. I mean, so it's but they bring the rich diversity of the modern Senate to the room here for what'll be an interesting conversation. They're unified, however, in their shared commitment to making America a more innovative and dynamic society that can compete, effectively in this modern age. And I really do admire them both for what they have done. We're going to talk about this, the project that Naveen Jaishankar, and he's going to lead this conversation, is we call the technology edge, securing the edge. This goes back about a year ago, and I have a defense background and used to the discipline of what we call net assessments. And, a net assessment is meant to be a very dispassionate, unemotional review of your strengths and weaknesses, the strengths and weaknesses of an opponent, and where there are priorities that should guide you for your planning. And I said to Naveen, we don't have a disciplined net assessment when it comes to China and technology. We've got a lot of heavy breathing going on here in Washington, a lot of paranoia, but we don't really have a disciplined, unemotional review of technology and the deeper ecosystem that's required for innovation. Thanks to Naveen, he took that on, and I say that the two senators that would be ideal to have this conversation, to launch this, is the two of you. Thank you both. Delighted you're here. Naveen, take it over for real.
Thank you, Dr. Hamry. This is working. Dr. Hamry, thank you so much, and for the inspiration in launching this work. Senator Cantwell, Senator Young, really deeply honored that you would be here to join us for this conversation. Let me start out. Both of you have led on numerous aspects of the technology revolutions that are afoot and how the U.S. can stay ahead. There is some pessimism. Oftentimes you hear observers saying, well, maybe the U.S. has not really found its footing while China plays the long game. And while people throw up a question, you both have, in your various ways, thrown down an exclamation point that we, in fact, can have a long game. So let me maybe start with Senator Young and then Senator Cantwell. What, in your view, is the approach to the U.S. long game on technology?
Well, thank you, Naveen, and thanks to CSIS for kicking this initiative off and having Senator Cantwell and myself here, Senator Cantwell being, a leading tech advocate in Congress and somebody who's showed a lot of leadership, broadly speaking, as it relates to our technology portfolio. So we can lead. We can remain the leader because I think as it relates to most areas of technology, high technology, the United States leads in the development and ultimately the deployment and then the iterative redevelopment and redeployment of different technologies. But it's clear we need to up our game and we need to come up with a more systematic approach. I think it would be helpful for me to lay out just how I think about the tech long game. I've laid it out some months ago. I think it was last February that I published in the National Interest a piece you could find online if you like, entitled A Tech Power Playbook for Donald Trump 2.0. Mm-hmm. And in that Tech Power Playbook, I indicated that there are three things that our country needs to do. Number one, borrowing from Indiana University's great football team. I was prescient, one might say. But you need a strong offense. Number two, you need a strong defense. And then lastly, not to be underestimated, you need special teams. So the strong offense is investing in ourselves, using this moment of great power competition to become a better version of yourself. Investing in particular in research and development, but also in other areas of our ecosystem, infrastructure, workforce development, and so on. But I think that investment in research and development is really key. And the purpose there is to de-risk some of these technologies so that the private sector can step in. Mm-hmm. But it's also to come up with fundamental breakthroughs that benefit our entire economy and also our military effectiveness as well. The strong defense, it depends on the tech vector, but if you're talking about semiconductors, you can be thinking about export controls. We certainly need to harden ourselves against having our tech assets and our infrastructure in any way manipulated by our adversaries. One thinks of how some of our critical infrastructure has been infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party in recent years. We've been caught on our heels, so we need to have a much more robust defense. And then special teams is the importance, and I think we'll get into this later, of tech alliances, of not trying to do everything ourselves. We don't have enough resources to do that, but pooling our expertise and resources to train workers, to harden supply chains by coming up with redundancies in our supply chain so there's no critical point of failure when it comes to, say, semiconductors. We actually have multiple countries from which to source different things. And continuing to leverage the comparative advantage, the power of trade, but de-risking out of those countries that we can't depend on. And then lastly, special teams is, these are the group of individuals, and there are a number of ways to skin the cat. These are the individuals that make these connections and facilitate these connections with friendly and partner countries. In the CHIPS and Science Act, which Maria was instrumental in ushering through the committee as chairman of the Commerce Committee, we created a modestly funded group over at the State Department, the ITSE Fund, to train tech diplomats, to go out and work with other countries, identifying vulnerabilities in supply chains, and work together to fill those vulnerabilities and come up with these redundancies. It worked very well. We could adapt that model to some other technologies. But, I mean, this is the sort of construct that we need to apply tech sector by tech sector. And I do agree with John that we've got some work to do to look at the entire tech ecosystem. That could be a bit daunting, but we've got a major government enterprise here in Washington, D.C., and this is at once national security and economic security, so it's really important we get to work. I think in the near term, there are a few obvious things that we should be focused on as it relates to technology in Congress. Among them, artificial intelligence. There are some things we should be doing to come up with a legal and regulatory framework for AI that we haven't done to provide more certainty, because companies are only going to keep deploying these massive amounts of money if they have certainty about what the future looks like. Autonomous vehicles, much the same thing. We need permitting reform that I think is supported in a pretty strongly bipartisan way. But we need some leadership there to push that through Congress, get it on the president's desk. And there's some near-term opportunities to get started on this broader project that I think John alluded to in the beginning.
Highly compelling. I remember your Tech Power Playbook article. In fact, it motivated a lot of our research, and the football metaphor is even more compelling. Senator Cantwell, you've led on many of these things for many years. Both as the chair and now the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, across a number of pieces of landmark legislation. What's your version of the long game?
Well, Naveen, thank you so much. Thank you to CSIS for this invitation. It's great to be here with my colleague, Todd Young. And yes, we loved working on CHIPS and Science Act together and getting it over the goal line. Really, really important. And glad that he is such a loud voice on the continuation of those priorities. And it's great to be here with him. I want to congratulate you on your Tech Edge report. I think that I love the focus on ecosystem. I love the focus on the competitive advantage that China has in scaling and the focus that we need to have on manufacturing as a response to that. Because that is something we really thought about in the CHIPS and Science Act. So when I think about the long game, I'm so blessed to represent the state of Washington in the United States Senate, one of the most innovative states, I think, in our country today. I break that down first and foremost by the number of scientists per capita, which is over 7%. So I think we probably lead as a state in that, particularly if you take out Virginia and Maryland, who just have a big housing of scientists working for the federal government. Why is that so important is because you want the constant ecosystem of those scientists and helping other people understand basic science and the proliferation of that science. So when I think about, Microsoft and AWS and Boeing and the space economy and the Allen Institute and their leadership on AI, and I think about, even just basic ag research that goes on in our state at WSU and a variety of other great institutions, it's an amazing, amazing ecosystem. I literally cannot keep up with the innovation in our state. I could spend weeks going around visiting companies and still not even break the barrier for how much innovation is going on. So when I look at that, the CHIPS and Science Act was how, if we think about this, and we had this telling moment when we had Secretary Raimondo come to Washington and we had a briefing and a bunch of people, and somebody pulled us aside and said, "Tell us where you're going and we'll follow." And we looked at each other and we were like, "What are you saying?" And this person said, "You can't do all the innovation you want to do in expensive places like Seattle and Silicon Valley. So we want to follow where you're going to make more innovation." So the point is, we need the Washington state ecosystem. It'll continue to thrive, trust me. There's no way you're slowing it down. There is just, I could go on for 15 minutes just about fusion and what's happening on fusion. But the point is, if America is going to compete with China, we need that innovation to be across the United States. We need to build the basis by which those innovative instruments and the structure of them exist in various places. Why? Well, when you think about it, our economy, two guys named Bill Boeing and Bill Gates. Okay, those are pretty big economies by two guys named Bill. So, but if there's another Bill in Montana or in Alabama or a particular focus, then the United States is unleashing that amount of R&D investment into growing something. So this is why the tech hub idea in the CHIPS and Science Act became so popular with our colleagues and so popular overall, because it is about, it's almost when Intel put the plant in Ohio, it's almost like saying the high-tech economy is coming to a theater near you. And the level of investment that's now happening in and around Columbus becomes its own generator of more investment in R&D. So what we need is we need the United States to continue, particularly in the information age. The information age is that innovation can happen faster. So there's a warning there. Well, that means some people can look at your research and try to knock it off, which is what happened with the AI and China trying to accelerate after the initial successes of OpenAI. But so we have to be mindful, and it's not just China. Other countries will also try to take our science and implement it. So we have to be smarter, and that's what the Tech Edge report says. What do we need to do to be smarter? So one thing we don't need to do is to cut the scientific research budget in the United States. So the fact that the Trump administration and DOGE and Vought all wanted to cut that, and now we're back to flat funding, at least with our portfolio in the NSF and NIST and all of that, is a big challenge. So somehow we got to get, Donald Trump to remember his, whatever it was, great uncle who worked at MIT and embrace the science investment part and stop shortchanging science investment. And obviously I don't agree on the tariffs. The tariffs are really having an effect. research takes years and years and years. So if you create an exodus of researchers from the United States because people don't like our tariff policies, it's a big mistake. So let's get those things right. Let's get the investment right, and let's pay particular attention to the fact that the competition is taking our research and implementing it. And what can we do to counter that? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go through this panel. But really excited about the amount. If people were like, what's going on in the Northwest, we would have no problem. Okay, not to just promote that, but it is, I'm sure that's happening in Boston. I'm sure that's happening in Silicon Valley. I don't have as much knowledge about how that really looks. But what I'm saying is, if you can make that level of investment across the United States, I guarantee you the rest will be there for the long game for us.
Thank you, Senator. You've highlighted what I would describe as enablers for innovation across different technologies. You mentioned R&D. Senator, you've mentioned workforce. Let me just double-click on the R&D piece, because I think the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act is an important thing not to forget. I want to just come back to you, Senator Cantwell, and then I'll move to you, Senator Young. The Genesis mission is a significant initiative by the Trump administration, and the idea is to create an AI-driven platform with federal scientific data and various capabilities to actually accelerate the productivity of scientific research. There's no money behind it, but it is a significant initiative, and Dario Hill, Undersecretary there in DOE, is leading that. Any thoughts on that and how that can be broadened to really answer the mail on what you've laid out?
Well, I love the Genesis approach, and I think Steve Ashby, who left our Pacific Northwest laboratory, is going to try to help across the labs, in the implementation of this, and Dario and I think Kratsios at OSTP. This is great leadership. It really is taking AI in the research at the labs and basically getting done what might take 3 to 5 years and getting it done in a few months. It's amazing. And when you think about that, that again speeds up the discovery and the research in a significant way. So I love the idea that when you think about, okay, what are we doing in the world of AI, and I do think we need to talk more about applications that get the American public excited, because we're hearing a lot of things that make them very anxious. But when you talk particularly on the biology side, and you can see at a national lab that here's this research and it was going to take us 5 years to figure out the chemistry behind this, but by applying AI and working machines 24/7, something that a human couldn't do, and we will figure out this biology in a few months, which will lead to some sort of breakthrough. Yeah. It's a great initiative. And so I applaud our national labs for doing that. And I hope that, we can think about, other applications, particularly on the healthcare side, with NIH. And, but it's really kind of like a low-hanging fruit when you think about it. Like, what can the government do to move faster on AI? This is one of the examples of getting our scientists, who really already understand AI and its implications, to apply it to their own research to get discovery in what I would call almost lightning speed.
Thank you, Senator. Talking about enablers, Senator Young, you've talked about speed and scale. Like, the Chinese move very, very quickly. We used to be known for big, bold engineering feats, and we can still do it. But we have some bottlenecks. One of them may be energy, another one workforce. You've mentioned some others. What are your thoughts on that piece of the playbook?
Well, thank you. Just very quickly,
Yes,
before I get into that, if I could just add on what Maria said. I agree. I think we're in agreement that there's an opportunity as it relates to research and development right now to take some of these ideas in the Genesis mission and make our research enterprise more productive. I do believe that in the end that's going to take not only continued investments, but sustained investments and maybe even more investment as called for in the science portion of CHIPS and Science in order to supercharge our tech enterprise and make sure we win this long game. I'd also emphasize that as we think about the tech revolution that's occurring, there's actually multiple revolutions going on, right? And so we need different things. We need energy in particular to sustain the age of AI, and permitting reform will facilitate that, as well as the deployment of more data centers. We need clearer rules in my own state, the most manufacturing intensive state in the country, so that we can enable this next generation of advanced manufacturing to occur. So, and then workforce. Workforce will be key across all these tech areas, but I think of semiconductors in particular. We said from the very beginning, we can come up with the most elegant piece of legislation possible, but if in implementation we don't succeed in training all the technicians all the way to the postdocs, this whole enterprise isn't going to be successful. So we've got a lot to think about in terms of enablement, but the bottlenecks, to turn to that, we should be thinking about speed. We should be thinking about scale. Scale's less of a problem oftentimes here in the United States because we have a massive domestic economy. Historically, we've developed strong trade relationships. We have the scale, assuming we continue to trade with the rest of the world, and there's demand for these high-tech products. But I think in terms of speed, that's really where our federal government is stumbled a bit over the years. When seeking permits, there needs to be predictability about what the rules are. There needs to be a time limitation when seeking permits. A shot clock, so to speak, would be a good practice, but at the very least, optimize systems so that you can get through the process quickly, and so that there is certainty with respect to the investment environment. At some point, if you're an investor in autonomous vehicles, for example, you can continue to invest in these elegant technologies that have the ability to provide mobility to senior citizens and to people with disabilities and improve public safety and do these enormous things that also have national security spillover implications. But the investment will stop if the investors lose faith in our regulatory system, because it becomes impossible to assess what your hurdle rate is for any given investment. So this is sometimes the boring but highly important work of government, where we should on an ongoing basis be weeding the garden. We need to be optimizing these systems. The one that is really I'm fixated on right now, because I think it's within the realm of the achievable, just if not today, then in coming months, and it's permitting reform, because it makes so much else possible and so many of these other tech areas possible. I also think some rulemaking, and the administration seems increasingly warm to this as it relates to AI, would make some sense. And so those are some near-term opportunities, I think, for good bipartisan work, and hopefully work through Congress, not just the executive branch, because if we're working through Congress, we have the ability to make permanent law, which provides further certainty as opposed to executive orders.
And you've laid out with speed and scale certainly a bipartisan agenda, I think. You've talked about what is it going to take to what we call play all the keys across different technologies, and you talked about enablers, both of you. Speed and scale. The third thing, and again, I should thank you for your encouraging words about the work, and we are here to give as many ideas as we can to leaders such as yourself to the extent it could be helpful. The third one we mentioned is defending our networks, and you've talked about that, Senator Young. I'm going to start with you and then come to Senator Cantwell. We are in a world in which we can't do all things alone. In fact, we have had traditional allies for 3 generations that are part and parcel of our technology ecosystem. But there's some friction in light of the trade agenda that we are currently seeing roll out. What are your thoughts on how to fortify those networks in the moment that we're in?
Sure. The CHIPS and Science Act is often perceived, I think, by probably people outside this room as an economic development play. As a domestic initiative That's how many advertised it, going around the country. But I actually thought it was more of a foreign policy play, an economic security play. Because from the beginning, we knew it was, number one, we knew that we didn't, what were our goals? Our goals were never to become independent of other countries when it comes to particular components of a semiconductor. There are thousands of inputs that go into a semiconductor, and so it would be highly expensive and problematic to try and reshore all of that. Number two, it would be it would be inconsistent with our experience, which we become wealthy by being a trading nation. We become powerful, mobilizing our soft power to leverage that soft power and establish economic relationships with other countries. We tried to de-risk out of China and single points of failure around the perimeter of China into other countries that we can generally depend on to provide things when they say they're going to, and to play by the rules and establish more redundancies. And so a key component of that was these tech diplomats, some of whom resided at the State Department, others at Commerce and Treasury, identifying nodes that needed to be shored up and coming up with creative solutions, working with the private sector and private investors to develop these solutions. And so this sort of analysis is going to have to occur on an ongoing basis. We regularly get better at our supply chain mapping, working with the private sector again, but there needs to be a government component to it to look at the entire enterprise and make sure that we're not baking vulnerabilities into the system. To make this real for a second, we all remember the global pandemic. Most of us want to forget it. But some of us were assured and then reassured for months and even years at a time that the markets would heal our supply chain problems, right? The markets would adjust. Well, you go to Walmart, you try and buy whatever, a toaster or a calculator, you go to a car lot and try to get a vehicle, and you discover the markets weren't adjusting. There were some very sticky problems that could not be addressed in short order. A modern economy depended on looking at these things beforehand.
Yeah.
And the incentive to ensure that these nodes were addressed before a catastrophe hit were not internalized to individual investors or businesses. It's what you call a market failure. There are still some prominent editorial pages who have not admitted that a market failure occurred, right? And so that's the job of tech alliances, is collectively working on these very hard problems together. And I don't think there's any other way, any other smart way to win the tech long game.
Yeah, powerful concept. Senator Cantwell, you've talked about a tech NATO. And so when we build out this idea of a tech alliance, share with us your vision for that, particularly as we see an accelerating competition with China.
Well, I definitely believe in a co-opetition strategy with China, where you compete and cooperate on some things. I would cooperate, if you could, on clean energy solutions that could drive down the cost, something that would say something like the, export of technologies that don't have, extra cost to them just to get it implemented. But I definitely think we need to use our might to counter China. And the best way to do that is to create alliance with other smart technology countries. If you just took us and Japan and Europe and India and basically a few others and said, okay, we're going to say these are the rules of the road for technology. You can't have a government backdoor. You have to, respect these IP rights. You have to do this. And the world should only buy from countries who meet these standards. If we were successful at really getting countries to embrace that, which they already do, the key democracies and key technology leaders, then we wouldn't be running around the globe trying to rip out Huawei equipment, which is what we're doing now. And there'll be another version of that down the road. And so why do that? Why not just set the standards right now for what the information age and democracy looks like and get people to unite here? And I think that this will, play out in the AI debate as well, because like what kind of information and what kind of stacks, and there's some alliance building there. So the United States can ignore this and have China continue to go around the globe promulgating their own economic strategy and convincing countries who have less resources to deploy their technology. Or we can work in an alliance way. And in fact, I think we did this in aerospace. I think it was called the Cape Town Accords, where you say, look, if you buy into these principles, we'll help you get a discount on the technology and we'll help you get it deployed. Right now, China goes and offers that, but we know it comes with a price. And we should be countering this in a very big way, I believe, by this alliance of the countries. And most people, the American public is hungry for this, and I guarantee you people in other countries are also hungry. What are the real rules of the road, for democracies and technology? What are the real rules that should be there? I guarantee you we're not putting enough pressure on China to live up to those standards. Well, the best way to do that is a barrier of acceptance and saying that the world is not going to accept these practices.
Thank you both for sharing your vision for the long game. And, this is marching orders for us as we go into the next phase of the Tech Edge work. And I really appreciate and I'm honored that you came and spent some time with us. We'll keep watching what you're doing because that's going to give us the North Star on the work that we're doing. Thanks to both of you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
On the next segment, that was a wonderful conversation with both Senator Cantwell and Senator Young. Both have been leaders on many aspects of the U.S. technology strategy vis-a-vis the PRC. And I'm really glad to have Sri Ramaswamy and Mark Dallas join me for this segment, which is we're now going to start hearing from CSIS experts. By way of introduction, I had the great fortune of working with Sri in the Commerce Department in the previous administration. He came there after a long career in the private sector at McKinsey. He's now the Chief Innovation Officer at Noble Reach. Really a leader, and people don't know, and I'll sing his praises, was really instrumental in the design and the implementation of the CHIPS Act. So he spent a lot of time with the senators who we just heard from over the past few years, and has been a great partner in doing the Tech Edge report with us. He's one of our affiliates here at CSIS. And Mark Dallas as well, who's a professor at Union College in upstate New York, but also was at BIS in the Commerce Department as an economist and a technologist. And he was also a great partner on this effort. So Mark, you're zooming in. Thank you for joining us. Let me just get started with the Tech Edge here for a second. Sri, when we got started, you said, hey, listen, the U.S. has been trying to play the long game for a long time. And there have been footfalls and there have been swings this way and that way over the years. And we went all the way back to the 80s during the Reagan era and looked at what has been done. Tell us what has been the challenge over the years with the U.S. strategy around technology and reindustrialization.
So I think, first of all, thank you all for joining us. And it was a great experience working on this report with Naveen and Mark and the rest of the CSIS team. Look, I think part of taking the long game is to also look at the historical arc, right? You sort of have to understand how we've gotten to this position before you can figure out how do you get out of this hole and move forward. And one of the things that we've seen is this, there are certain myths that keep showing up when American policymakers, think tanks, scholars, when we're thinking about the US-China competition or the US technology ecosystem. There are a couple of these myths that just keep showing up. We've talked about this in the report, right? I think we talked about 6 of them. I can lay out 1 or 2 of these as examples. And what the myths do is, from a policy standpoint, they do a couple of things. One is it creates this sense of, let's focus on this piece of this puzzle and neglect other pieces of the puzzle. That's fine, and things will take care of themselves. It creates that condition. It also creates this situation where, depending on who is in charge here in DC, different elements of the policy ecosystem are emphasized at the expense of everything else. And so you get this whiplash sort of thing, which you can clearly see going on now as well, right? Whereas in reality, what you have to see is, you have to see the whole puzzle, right? You have to see all the different pieces. So one example of this is, we often think about, the US, the innovation system here is 1,000 flowers blooming, right? Hundreds of universities and venture capital and thousands of startups. And in China, it's all top-down, and it's all state-driven, and they'll never be able to, maybe they can catch up, but they'll never be able to truly innovate, right? And so the policy response for that sort of a myth is for us to say, okay, the way for us to drive innovation is to continue to seed those flowers. That's what we should do. Keep seeding as many flowers as we can, and things will be fine. And that myth completely ignores the fact that innovation in China is not top-down. There is cutthroat competition that goes on, right? There's dozens and dozens of companies that enter the market in these technology industries, and there's crazy competition about who's going to be first to market, what are the features of a product, how do you do, there's price competition, there's quality competition going on. And in contrast, in the US, what you find is, yes, thousands of flowers blooming, but startups that find it really difficult to scale, new companies that find it very difficult to break through, right? Entrenched incumbents, industry concentration is increasing. And so you kind of have to think about innovation policy then in the context of competition policy. And you cannot separate those two out in the US, right? And so, but instead what you see is, we'll just seed a few more of these flowers and magic will happen. And it doesn't, right? That's kind of one example of a myth that we talk about in the report.
Yeah, and then just to before going to Mark, there are a couple of other ones that I thought that were like striking, that China only cheats to get ahead rather than innovate. But wouldn't you say that, Senator Young was just here, he did this biotech commission. More and more, they are the center of global innovation in more and more areas. And it's not just about cheating, they're actually good. And we have to get better. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Look, I think one of the other myths that I found particularly challenging when I was in the government, things like chips and science, things like the biomanufacturing initiatives, like these are really critical things, right? But they are not the end game. I think one of the myths that we have to deal with in this country is this idea that there are this holy set of shiny objects, these critical technologies, that if you can somehow focus on these critical technologies, we'll be fine, right? So, and there's all these debates going on about what is that set? Is it bio? Is it quantum? Is it AI? Nuclear? Whatever. And that myth perpetuates and creates 2 challenges for us. One is technology is not static, it is dynamic, right? So people will often dismiss, we don't really care about shoes and textiles and clothing. We really need to focus on quantums. Like, well, right. Yeah, that's fine until you realize that in the Arctic theater, suddenly wearable becomes a new technology domain, and now you have to fight the Chinese or the Russians in that domain, right? And you're like, oh crap, we've lost all of our synthetic textile manufacturing. Now what do we do, right? And so you create this static view of technology which defeats the policy initiative. And then the other angle is, when you look at these verticals, bio, quantum, semiconductors, what you realize is 2 or 3 layers beneath those verticals is where I think the truly critical technologies are, right? These are what people would call the industrial commons. what some people have called the mother industries. They are very unsexy industries, right? These are, machine tools, alloy forging, right? Electronics packaging, synthetic chemicals. And when you lose those technologies, as this country has done, and what the Chinese have done is heavily invested in those technologies, it makes it very difficult to pick your shiny object and really be able to scale technologies and engineering to create products in those industries, right?
And it also means that we have vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the Chinese in doing that.
In exactly those areas.
Excellent, excellent. So one of the ideas, this is a great tee-up for what I'm going to ask Mark. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so one of the things that we argued is that the United States needs to develop dexterity across the advanced technologies that Sri mentioned, as well as the ones that support those. So what he talked about as mother industries, as well as advanced or acceleration technologies. And then the second thing we argued, and this is I'm going to hand over to you here for a second, is that you can't focus on the individual breakthrough or the individual superstar. Those are important, obviously, but you want to look at what drives those things. And hence, Senator Cantwell, I'm glad she raised it. It's the ecosystems, the fertile soil within which these things grow is what matters, right? So help us think about the framework, because we tried to take a different view on a topic that is discussed widely in Washington, D.C. So what do we mean by ecosystems, and what do we mean by different types of technologies, and how did we approach that?
Yeah, I think those are two of the things that really make the report quite distinctive, because there's a lot of reports out there on US, China, and a lot of them, they're comparing who's ahead and who's behind. But I think we started with a fundamentally different question, as Naveen alluded to, which is really, what is the underlying drivers of competitiveness, technological competitiveness, and really keying in on this idea of ecosystems, which really is the composite of firms, labs, universities, obviously government agencies, and all of the public-private partnerships that can be created, in which these actors synergistically work together to remain on the cutting edge of technology. And so one of the frameworks we develop is really, what are the building blocks? And we categorize 4 different building blocks that really drive ecosystem long-term technological advantage and the strength of ecosystems. Things like economy-wide fundamentals, very broad things like rule of law and quality of capital markets, as well as other sort of technology and even firm-level capabilities. So the report has quite a bit on what those building blocks are that drive it in the long term. And then we also, again, addressing sort of what Sri had already sort of mentioned, we looked across the landscape of technologies and we realized, hey, the US and China are very strong in some, and they're also very weak in others. And so how do we make sense of this variance? And so we developed a technology framework, essentially, in which we divide technologies into 4 groups along how complicated the technologies are, and then the diffusion potential. So for instance, we looked at AI in particular, and we call these stack technologies. So AI is an example of a stack technology, where highly complicated, as we know, but it's also a general purpose technology. So it's going to be diffused across the economy over time with a lot of spillovers. Whereas something like jet engines, which we call this category of precision technology, also very, very complicated, but it's more specialized production technology. The other 2 technologies that we look at are production technologies like machine tools and base technologies like rare earths, so is the example that we look into. And so this is useful, these 2 frameworks, using them together is useful because, given this diversity in ecosystem needs, there's different configurations of ecosystems that are required, different partnerships that need to be created in order to excel in these different technologies. So there's really no one-size-fits-all, essentially, in terms of both policy and partnerships. It also helped us identify, better policy recommendations, better targeted policy recommendations. But also, Sri also alluded to this a bit, is that we realized that these technologies are intertwined with each other as well. So as the whole world has learned recently, right, complex advanced semiconductors are reliant on rare earths, right? So there's a link between these that is critical. Similarly, something like jet engines relies on machine tools, right? So you can't just look at, like what Shri said, those shiny, new technologies only because there's insecurity below the surface. And so that's where we developed this idea of tech dexterity. We need greater technological dexterity to hit upon all of these weak points in the ecosystems.
That's nicely stated. I think you captured a complex set of issues really just succinctly. Now what does this all mean when it comes to assessing how we stack up vis-a-vis the PRC? So let me start with Mark, and then I'll come back to Shri. We talked about a couple of areas where America leads and America lags. So can you give us some of your high-level points that are in the report on how we stack up, and then I'm going to come back to Shri.
Well, let me say a little bit about our data first, because
Yeah.
I think that's another really distinctive thing. There's a lot of opinion out there about, who leads and who doesn't. There's even some cherry picking of data to prove your point. But what we really try to do is we try to systematize data collection. And this was sort of at a very high level. So like the 4 building blocks, broad things, like I mentioned, economy-wide fundamentals. We collected data, US and China, but in a cross-national comparison. Where do these countries locate within a cross-national comparison? Like quality of rule of law, capital markets, quality of infrastructure and whatnot. So at a very, very, very high level, we collected systematic data on that. But then once you go down into individual technologies, we collected quite a bit of data on, customized data on particular industries and firms, benchmarking AI models, or, all the major engine manufacturers, how large their installed base of engines are. So we got into the nitty-gritty as well. And so I think that's another thing that's quite distinctive and good. And by the way, I'll mention that this is an ongoing project. So we have some preliminary good stuff in the report, but this will be going on in the future as well, where we continue to collect a lot of data.
Yeah, and before you go to the China versus US comparison, let me just mention one thing, which is you do see a lot of net assessments, as John Hamre was mentioning, where the measure is what's technological capability, a snapshot of where the US is versus China, or a commercial performance of companies. And what we've tried to do with measuring ecosystems is say, what are the underlying drivers? You can measure them. Sometimes it's complex to do, which is why we need to put a lot of effort into the methodology. But if you do that, you'll get a better sense of when the next shoe will drop, which is really the essence of this, right? So it's not just that DeepSeek happened, for example. It's what are the drivers for DeepSeek. And if I can understand the drivers, then I can understand the likelihood of the next 5 DeepSeeks. That's the essence of what we've been trying to do here. And I think your leadership on that really was quite phenomenal. Now, let's go to how we stack up. Actually, let me come to Shri, and then you come back. How do we stack up? America lead, America lag. Where and why?
Okay. So I would encourage folks to read the report to get the full picture, because I've already forgotten most of it. But look, I think one of the interesting things about this report was we were asking almost these sorts of binary questions, right? Going back to chips and science. Why is it that we lost advanced semiconductors, but we haven't lost jet engines? Why not, right? Why is it that we are struggling with machine tooling, but so are the Chinese? And the Japanese and Germans have got the advantage on that. What happened there? Why is it that both ecosystems seem to have failed on that one? So these are the sort of questions we've been asking ourselves. And then you ask yourself, what are the implications of these? Going back to Mark's point about the 4 types of technologies, is if you look at something new, let's say you look at, sodium batteries, or you look at the next generation of lithium batteries, how is this going to play out now? What do these 4 examples tell you about what's going to happen in batteries, right? That's the point of looking at these. You look at the stories of these technologies, not for the technologies themselves, but they are examples or they're illustrations of an underlying theme around the ecosystem, which can then give you clues about other technologies, right? Why is it that we do a really great job with synthetic proteins, but we do a terrible job of building fermentation tanks to get those proteins out into products, right? And so these are the sorts of things we were looking at. And so what you see in general is that the US is doing really well where these ecosystems are holding up, right? And so an example of this with the jet engine. So what does it mean to be in an ecosystem, right? So think about the jet engines example. This is a technology that develops in an environment where you have, between the FAA and other regulatory authorities, some very, very well-respected global standard setting of what good technology should do, right, in terms of safety and performance and everything else, number one. Number two, that is linked to very demanding customers who want to make sure, for their own reasons, of course, this is all about self-interest, that's fine, right? But there are customers, the big airlines, the big airplane producers, the OEMs, who will want to respect that safety certification, in some cases even take it beyond that, right? Number two. Number three, you have a defense department in this country that has a significant acquisition budget that makes sure that its acquisition both allows for new entrants to come in, such as SpaceX, for instance, but also makes sure that the demand signal that it provides to these corporate players gives them a cushion against the capital market cycles, right? So when the business cycle goes down, private sector and its investors know that there is still demand, they can still continue to function, right? They don't have to cut assets or fire workers. What that means is you have long-standing relationships within that industry. You have firms that last for a long time. You have OEM supplier linkages that go on for a long time. All of these firms have the confidence to make investments because they know they can have a long horizon to recoup the investments. What that means is you have decades and decades of tacit knowledge and learning that has happened both inside of these firms and between the company and OEM or the OEM supplier interfaces, right? So all of that knowledge has been gained. You have a lot of research funding going on to universities where these industries are working with the universities, so new people are being trained in that tacit knowledge. That is an ecosystem, right? And so you look at what the Chinese have been trying to do for years is try to replicate that advantage and have not succeeded, right? Because this is a moat for the US that protects it and allows it to continue making those investments. Senator Young talked about that, right? Kind of not just about defending what you have, it's about reinvesting so that you keep moving, right? That is the ecosystem of jet engines. You compare that to something where the US has lost the advantage. If you look at things like, advanced semiconductors or machine tooling, right? Those are cases where you had individual producers who were exposed to capital market cycles, right? They were selling into industries that were also like the automobile industry that were low margin. They did not have the kind of regulatory protection. They did not have the demand signals from the government or anywhere else that could cushion the capital market cycles. And in that kind of situation, it basically becomes every man for himself in the private sector, right? Every firm is now squeezed between a Chinese firm that is cutting prices and dropping profits and its own investors that are sitting out there saying, you need to go asset light, you need to squeeze your suppliers to boost your profit margin. Every American company is caught in that vice. What happens? Long-standing firm relationships become transactional arm's length relationships, learning loops break down, knowledge gets lost, and you see that kind of ecosystem fraying, right? So that you see that pattern in many industries across this country, and those are all the places where we are trailing now.
That's good. I'm going to come back to you on what we do about it. But before I do that, Mark, what about China? And we're going to get more into this with our colleagues who worked on those chapters, but give us a high level on how we stack up.
Sure. So with China, we found clear strengths in AI, from the AI stack, as well as in base technologies, such as rare earths. With AI, what's interesting is, or all stack technologies, the nature of the industry is layered. And so, yes, there are clear weaknesses that China has, such as in compute, much of it US imposed, but really they're able to make up for it in terms of algorithmic efficiency, where their strengths are, data quality, as well as a big push like the AI plus policies to get the technologies diffused. So what's interesting about these stack technologies is weaknesses are more likely to be able to be compensated by other strengths elsewhere. But in terms of what was really interesting about looking deeply into rare earths, I mean, everyone knows the basics about, sort of their enormous market share in processing, especially in heavy rare earths, 90% plus global market share. And everyone knows the story of decades of their policies, production quotas, export quotas, being willing to earn very, very margin thin profits. But they've innovated, and this goes to the point, one of the myths that Shri mentioned in the beginning. There's an enormous amount of innovation. So I hope people don't think, oh, it's just mining, simple, right? May take a long time, but simple. No, when we looked at specialized journals of rare earths, and just the number of Chinese scientists at the high end doing that kind of research, but also enormous training programs in the major areas like Jiangxi and Inner Mongolia, training programs from vocational training all the way up, things that we just do not have at all. I read a news article that said University in Utah is going to be offering a course in rare earths, whereas China has got entire schools that are specialized in it. So that goes to Shri's point and our point in the report that there is real innovation here and real catch up, even in a mining technology, which some may think is just simpler and easier to catch up in.
Excellent. So what do we do about it? We've argued in the report that the U.S. long game needs to involve three things. Playing all the keys, which is focus on multiple technologies that are interconnected that will matter for growth and security into the future. Both the acceleration technologies like AI, but also the more rudimentary stuff that we can't let go of. We have actually, that have atrophied. Steel and aluminum, rare earths, machine tools, so on and so forth. Second is speed and scale. I think Senator Young talked about that. This is a huge issue. It's kind of where we used to lead and we're falling behind, and it flows through to every sector. And then the third is defending the networks, which is we have relied on traditional allies and we continue to do so. Machine tools, high end is an example of it with Japan and European producers. And so these are three pillars. I'd invite you to take a look at that. What I might do here is ask Shri and Mark just to give us an example. Shri, you talked about speed and scale. You could pick whichever one you want, but that might be an interesting one because you've spent a lot of time on these industrial commons, this missing middle between laboratory and deployment. Explain that to us, and why is that going to matter in terms of achieving speed and scale?
Yeah, happy to do that. So look, the speed to scale section in the report, there's a bunch of different aspects to it. Obviously, there's the permitting and construction. When it comes to energy, there's the workforce piece, so how do you quickly train workers? There's the adoption piece, how do you make sure that new technologies are being adopted much faster than they are right now, right? So there's all of those issues. But you're right, one of the key elements that I personally think is really important here is innovation is not the same as scientific research, right? One of the things that I had to do in government was to explain to people the difference between scientific research and engineering research, right? What is the difference? The difference is scientific research happens in a lab environment, and in this country, we do quite a good job, actually, of scientific R&D. You can always spend more, right? Spending more on science and scientific R&D is like spending more on workforce. You can always spend more. But where we are failing is when those technologies leave the lab environment and come to the real world, right? In the real world, they need real-world infrastructure. There's a testing and learning and engineering curve that they have to go through. It is very capital-intensive. It is very painful, right? This is why engineers have such low self-esteem, because we keep failing all the time, right? The whole point of engineering is to fail and learn and then eventually succeed, one hopes. But that curve, the underappreciated fact, a part of the fact that we've lost our manufacturing and industrial base is that we've lost the engineering base, right? We don't have those tool makers, those chemical makers, those little suppliers who can work alongside an innovator, right? To build the equipment, build the tools, change the processes, change the quality metrics, to do all of that in a testing and learning environment. That is what we're calling speed. That's the piece of speed to scale that we're focusing on. One of the suggestions we have is we do have existing policy infrastructure. It's called the Manufacturing USA Network. It started life as the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation in the Obama administration. It was expanded in the first Trump administration. It was expanded in the Biden administration to different types of institutes that focus on different technologies and processes. But we would like to see that kind of institutional framework focus not so much on pre-competitive technology demonstration, because universities can do that. What they need to focus on is this later stage of testing, engineering, and qualification to prepare things for the commercial markets, right? And so that requires more investment, a change in the policy guidelines for that piece of infrastructure. But that's one of the recommendations in the report.
Excellent. Mark, defend the network. Give us one example of the recommendations we made. You know, Senator Cantwell talked about the defense part. So did Senator Young. What did you recommend in the report?
So yeah, I mean, we recommend it. I don't want to take credit for everything. That, you know, with Defend the Network, it's this typical struggle between maintaining growth and really achieving base level economic security given our current environment. And so overall, I think our approach is that, you know, interventions have to be targeted and minimal to the needs at hand. I think that's at a broad level. But, you know, sort of in terms of export controls, you know, they have to be surgical. But we're really pushing an idea of making them more multilateral, both in terms of assisting our partners and allies in improving their processes of enforcement and licensing, but also sort of furthering an idea that's been floating around Washington of a new COCOM, essentially, to address weaknesses of the Wassenaar arrangement, such as, you know, it's not strategic enough and focused on problems like China, you know, the cutting edge of commercial technology as it bleeds over more into military and targeting those rather than it being purely military, and harmonizing across countries, across allies and partners in terms of licensing and enforcement. So that's one that we recommend, but, you know, in terms of defending the network, there were others such as, you know, really, you know, import restrictions should be conduct-based, not broad sectoral import restrictions. We have recommendations on, you know, IP protection, as well as ideas on, you know, new trade and investment agreements with, in particular with allies, to pool resources and focus them on weaknesses, essentially.
Excellent. And several of these have already priced in what the Trump administration is doing. And our recommendations are some of these could be filled out more. Some of them just need to be implemented. And we think that there's a lot to go on there as well, I should mention. We will have a separate session after this one where we go into more depth around 3 chapters where we talk about China, the U.S., and our allies. I'm going to do that next. But Chris, do we have a couple minutes if people have questions? Yes? Either in the audience or online? Yeah. Yes, sir. Andrew Reamer.
Hi, Andrew Reamer, George Washington University. Great job. Question regarding mechanisms for public-private collaboration around technology development and policy. So when I look at U.S. history, successes come when government and business work together. In the Second World War with Vannevar Bush and OSRD. And today there's something called LiBridge, which is the lithium. It's the lithium consortium of DOE and the manufacturers who are seeking to create pilot lines. So how do you facilitate the interaction of government and the private sector in the way that the private sector will lean in?
Yeah, good question. This is something we were dealing with even with Chips and Science, right? There's a significant R&D program which is meant to be a public-private partnership. Look, I think I'm going to get candid in some of these things, right? Whether this is LiBridge or the CHIPS R&D program or any of the other Manufacturing USA networks, when we say public-private partnership, the question is who is driving the agenda, right? In a typical infrastructure scenario, when you think about a public-private partnership, it is a public agenda with private participation. What we often find in government R&D programs when we talk about public-private is it turns out to be a private agenda with public participation. Doesn't make any sense, right? And so one of the challenges we see, because what that does is it creates this back to this, you know, the role of the public sector is to seed the flowers and then step back, right? And instead what the role of the public sector needs to be to build that ecosystem, which means the public sector needs to specify certain grand challenges. The public sector needs to specify what problems are worth solving, and if those problems are solved and those outcomes are met, there will be a demand signal associated with that, right? If you don't have those sorts of things, what happens in these public-private partnerships, what we've seen, is that it sort of defaults to, well, we'll just let industry drive the agenda, and then industry is a mythical concept. There are individual firms, right, that make individual choices, and so you end up with public funding going to essentially benefit incumbent firms, for the most part, right? I'm being a little bit stark. You do have a lot of incremental benefits. You do see new facilities being created, new lab projects, new research projects being driven, but you don't see those ecosystems forming unless you have a public agenda, public certification, public demand that is associated with that public-private partnership.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Shri mentioned specific case of jet engines, but also the other case of machine tooling and semiconductors not being here as a a talent hub. Are these because these are like labor-intensive industries which eventually we decided to cost arbitrage, and jet engines somehow remains more sort of an engineering-heavy supply chain industry? Or did you find second-order effects of, apart from just some industries just going away, were there labor, were there water considerations, environmental considerations that led to these industries going away?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me do this. Mark, why don't you take a bite at that, and then I'll give it to Shri.
I actually got cut off. Why
okay.
don't you give it to Shri? I'm sorry.
All right, go ahead.
I didn't hear it.
Go ahead.
Okay. Short answer is no. All right. There are some industries that we have lost because of the labor intensity and the extremely low labor cost in certain places. Okay. That is not an excuse for us to say that we lost our industrial base by and large because of that. We've lost them because we did not have the right ecosystem in place, right? When you don't have the right ecosystem in place, why do companies say that labor costs are too high? They say that because they're getting pressure on their margins, right? When a company sees pressure on its profit margin, it looks at its cost base and says, how do I alleviate the cost base to preserve my margin? And so if you're an industrial firm, the two biggest sources of cost are your labor and your supply chain, right? Which is why American firms will squeeze their supply chain and their labor force. The question then becomes, why are you facing the pressure on your margin in the first place? Why is it that our ecosystem has not come together to protect not just that one firm, but all firms so that they can keep making investments, they can keep training their workers, they can keep upgrading their supply chains? That is not a labor cost problem, right? That is a capital markets problem. And so that's part of, I think, the discussion that this report gets at, and something that we were trying to solve with the CHIPS program, right? It was not just a question of labor costs. We were trying to figure out how do you catalyze private capital in a way that is long-term, using public money as a way to not substitute for private capital, but to crowd it in.
And we have a recommendation there for an American Dexterity Fund, Technology Dexterity Fund, which basically blends U.S. public capital, such as the monies that the Office of Strategic Capital in the the Department of War uses, along with commitments made, for example, from allies like Korea and Japan. Blend that along with American publics and American institutional investors, and that becomes 8 to 10x leverage in a commingled fund that could support these sorts of things. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that recommendation as well. Sure, one more question? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question is towards, earlier you mentioned about higher education research, and so I'm just so curious on just expanding on the role of higher education research to the ecosystem that we've talked about today.
Yeah, Mark, as a professor, would you like to take that?
Sure. Now, of course, I think that's one of our strengths. And so, U.S. are leading universities in these areas. And we have to make sure we double down on that strength. I think that's one of the key things. We can't be taking away funding from that strength. However, I think a lot of what we focused on in terms of just the broader education realm is a lot more need for funding and resources and organization and standards, sort of the bottom level of the educational ladder. So certifications for vocational training and whatnot, where we really lack. And so one of the ideas in there, I know it's not university research, but we develop an idea of a national AI workforce consortium that also addresses what Andrew talked about with a public-private partnership, where we really standardize credentialing, standardizing assessment of training, and allowing these credentials to be portable across borders. So I think that's where the weakness is in terms of our educational realm. I say university research we're doing well, and we can double down and increase it would be, I think, we say in the report.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Mark and Sri. This was the work of many hands. These were two of the scholars that worked on this report. We're going to hear from the rest of them. There were 15 in total of people working on it, so we're really proud of this effort, and hopefully it'll be of value to the country. And maybe give Mark and Sri a round of applause. This report that covers so many issues is it's hard to pack it all in. So this is more a way of a teaser for people to take a look at the report, and of course your feedback is most welcome. Just by way of introduction, Matt Pearl leads our Strategic Technologies program, is the director, a long parkour in U.S. government, including most recently, before he joined us, in the NSC. Joseph Mycott is the head of our Energy Security and Climate Change program, a scientist in his own right, as well as extensive experience on the Hill and across Washington. Rick Rosso runs our India and Emerging Asia Economics program as the chair. Very, very long experience in India, and really an interesting window on how India and the U.S. could collaborate on these issues, and we'll talk more about that. And of course, Scott Kennedy, who is the trustee chair. He's joining us remotely for Chinese business and economics. Scott is often in Beijing and Shanghai and other parts, and has written extensively about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Scott on the China chapter, which is a double click on what you've heard from Sri and Mark. And then we're going to go to Matt and Joseph on the US chapter, and then Rick on the partners chapter, which is how do we work with our traditional and emerging allies, technology allies. So let me start with Scott. Scott, you know, Sri and Mark were talking about some myths that have really, I would say, weighed us down in terms of coming up with an American long game on technology. One of those myths is that China only cheats to get ahead, and it doesn't have genuine creativity and innovation. And I think recent years has really demonstrated that that's not the truth, but you went into a lot more detail around this and really illuminated the nature of innovation in China. But let me start there, and then we can go further with your chapter.
Sure. Well, thanks, Naveen, and congratulations to you, to Mark and Sri, for leading this report work over the last several months. And also wanted a shout out to my colleagues, Ilari Mazzocco and Ryan Featherston, who also contributed with me and Mark on the chapter on China. And I guess it's really important to emphasize that, of course, yes, there's been a lot of IP theft, coercion, cyber theft, but over the years, China has developed a genuine, serious, highly competitive, world-class innovation ecosystem that draws in immense amount of talent, throws in enormous amounts of capital, complex regulatory incentives to induce investment, long-term patient capital in priority areas, scales that up through manufacturing, diffuses it through China's economy, and of course exports it globally. And this cycle again and again continues. I think a related myth is that this is all top-down. Yes, Beijing is throwing a lot of money and policies at all of these issues, but a lot of the most successful areas of China in technology were ideas first developed in Chinese companies, most often private companies. Yes, lots of private-public partnerships in China, but technologies and ideas which did not germinate inside the regulatory halls of government and party agencies. And so you see a lot of government policies endorsing and supporting areas where there have already been business breakthroughs. Those are two of the most important myths that stand out in the work that we did in putting together this part of the Tech Edge report.
Yeah, and it's an excellent chapter. And let me double click on that. So if you take the different technologies that Mark was talking about, stack technologies, production technologies like machine tools, precision technologies like jet engines, rare earths or other base technologies, you looked at that and you looked at some illustrative examples. Can you give us a couple of examples of where China has clear strengths and why they have those strengths versus areas where they have weaknesses?
Of course. So to re-summarize what they've mentioned and what's in the report, and with a little bit of my own twist on this, the areas where the Chinese have really excelled is where they've been able to bring patient capital to a technology area where the progress is achieved through incremental learning, and where you can apply economies of scale to manufacture and scale up and use those advantages of the size of the Chinese market in government and business and households, 1.4 billion potential customers. And in addition, areas where Western and other countries have either turned away from those industries, for example, for environmental reasons, or just the politics and policy have decided to stay in an area where there's technological dominance and not move forward. So I'll just mention two where the Chinese have done really, really well, which we focus on some in this report. Rare earths, where the Chinese have invested a long time, patient capital. Mark mentioned the research hubs that have developed in Jiangxi in southern China and Inner Mongolia, in northern China, where the two locations of mining are for heavy and light rare earths. And China has just exploited this, and I don't think that they knew in the 1980s how important rare earths would be, but here we are in 2026, and they are taking full advantage of that. I would say another area has been in electric vehicle batteries, where the Chinese have put in enormous amounts of investment over the last 30 years, initially really in the private sector with companies like BYD and CATL, but the Chinese government has provided an enormous amount of industrial policy support for the batteries, for the vehicles that they're used in, support investing abroad now, and that's been a space where the US, Europe, and others have not focused on, even though we've had those technologies available to us for 3 decades. So those are a couple examples where the Chinese have moved ahead and done really well. And there are, of course, other areas where they've not done as well, including where we focus in the report on jet engines, I would say aircraft manufacturing in general. Those industries do not align with China's sort of policy and economic comparative advantages.
Excellent. Let me end with one to you, Scott, which is, in light of some of the things that Senator Young and Senator Cantwell and their colleagues have been developing as far as legislation is concerned, all building towards a U.S. long game, how should we expect the PRC to respond?
Sure. China can see this coming from a mile away. They expect the U.S. to have a grand strategy on technology, even though it's slow in coming. And of course, they have their own. I think it involves several components. The first is trying to develop talent in their universities, in their labs, in companies, attract talent that may be leaving the United States or West, because they know that at the heart of this is a talent competition. In addition, they're trying to reduce their technology dependencies on the U.S. and the West and get ahead, and we see those high investments in business uptake in particular in markets where we have now started to deny technology access to China, where businesses invest in China, is precisely because there's now a market gap that they can fill. I think we also see the Chinese weaponizing their advantages with rare earth elements and others to avoid being isolated from the rest of the world, because they know that the U.S. through tariffs, export controls, and other things are pushing others to reduce technology supplies to China, and they're fighting back against that. The last thing that they're doing is being extremely active in global and regional institutions to provide leadership, Chinese-style leadership that fits their interests at the WTO, APEC they're hosting this year, the G20. They're also deeply involved in setting global technical standards that best align with their interests. So it's clear that at the end of the day, these Chinese responses are geared toward them achieving leadership and avoid being isolated. Those are two things that the U.S. is also pursuing, and that means that anything that the U.S. does to isolate itself or limit itself from achieving global technology leadership are going to hurt us in this competition with China.
Thank you, Scott. Great rundown. I hope folks read his chapter with Ilaria and Ryan. Fantastic. Let's bring it home to the U.S. and Matt and Joseph. So you took a cut at how the U.S. stacks up across these different types of technologies. Matt, you actually have a program that looks at a number of these technology verticals and the underlying enablers. So get us started on what you have found in this analysis.
Yeah, so in terms of production, in terms of stack technologies, which are really in many ways the most important and combine the other types of technologies, AI being the most critical, the U.S. is still very competitive because they depend on really complex research networks, universities, and so on, deep capital markets, and that sort of innovation ecosystem that we have in Silicon Valley. But we do find that the PRC is really catching up, both in terms of its models, the investments that it's making, and some advantages it has on areas that Joseph has studied, like electricity and the ability to provide that to the AI stack. Then you've got, base technologies that's been discussed. That's an area where the U.S. has struggled. That really requires deep investments in infrastructure that the PRC has made, and so that's an area that the U.S. has really fallen behind in a lot of ways. You have production technologies. Those require vocational training, patient capital. The U.S. was actually an innovator in this area and in areas like precision machine tools. But due to that lack of patient capital and continuous vocational training, the U.S. really struggled and ceded that advantage to Germany and Japan and some other countries. And then finally, you have precision technologies. We looked at jet engines as a good example. And that's an area where really the U.S. has quite a moat because they're extremely complex. They require a lot of tacit knowledge that's developed over decades. They have very complex certification regimes. And so that's an area where the U.S. has been able to maintain its advantage. But I think for each of these, we've talked about how for each of them, we looked at the underlying drivers. But another aspect of it for each of them is the moat that they create, because that's really critical to understanding both, not only why you initially obtain an advantage in a technology, but why you're able to retain it. And also when there is a moment or a technology transition that presents an opportunity for the U.S. or an ally or partner to supplant the PRC, why that's the case. And so really looking at those moats is a really critical part of understanding why the U.S. is where it is on each of these technologies.
Excellent. And as you say, it's where the ecosystems really come together. Just one quick follow-up. We have the deepest and most liquid capital markets in the world. And yet, Sri has said it, you've said it, I know Joseph probably agrees with this. The patient capital piece is missing. What do you mean by that, just for folks to understand?
Yeah, so this is the ability to deploy capital over a long period of time when margins will be thin. And this is an area where, understandably, in our market-based system, Capital markets lenders are hesitant to do that. We certainly don't think that we should try to replicate the PRC in terms of using patient capital sort of across economy-wide. That wouldn't be a very good use of fiscal resources. But what we're talking about in terms of this dexterity fund really is a targeted way to use patient capital in really critical technologies where either we need to maintain our advantage or regain it.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Now, Joseph, I want to come to you. We've talked about enablers of various kinds, including with the senators, like workforce is an enabler, patient capital is an enabler, R&D is an enabler. Importantly, and something you've been leading on for many years, but really in the last 3 years you've been shining a light on it, is energy, power generation, and the grid as important enablers. Now, this has become very, very obviously important with the AI next gen, sort of the Gen AI infrastructure build out. But you were talking about this even before that, around manufacturing. Tell us what the nature of the challenge is.
Yeah, I mean, it's very straightforward. If you want to have semiconductor manufacturing back in the United States, for all of the security arguments that that brings, for the tacit knowledge that that creates so you can have a better innovation system in that portion of the tech stack, right? Think about the TSMC example in Arizona, right? This is a big policy success. It's a big business success to see that onshoring to the U.S. It'll put us again in a leadership position for manufacturing of very small transistors. Great. That whole ecosystem is going to take that facility plus the surrounding infrastructure will roughly absorb about 1.2 gigawatts of electricity on a nearly constant basis. For a point of reference, that is more electricity that is generated on an annual average basis from the Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam has more capacity than that, but it generates less because of the low water levels in the Columbia River. So you're talking about an amount of electricity which is like massively industrial in scale, right? Now that's one facility. Now we've got through the Chips and Science Act program a bunch of semiconductor fabs that we want to build around the country, oftentimes in places where there's less power availability than Arizona, for instance in New York. And so our work in this area, and it's highlighted in this report, has tried to assess like what is the economic drag that comes from our inability to add more electricity to the grid, and what kind of electricity, what are the characteristics of the grid system or the electricity that we can provide that companies want to keep us economically competitive. Obviously, availability is number one. Price, probably number two. And then we argue in our work, and we talk about it in this paper, that your ability to produce low carbon electricity is also increasingly important if you want to play the long game. Because it's not just what you manufacture, but all of the characteristics that go into it if we want to be competitive in international markets.
Yeah, phenomenal. Do you have any comment on what Senator Young said around speed and scale and some of the binding constraints there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the idea that permitting reform, which Senator Young brought up at least twice in his comments, as being a necessary and insufficient part of bringing the U.S. toward the next level in tech competition, is basically consensus here in Washington now. Yeah. Right? We've got Democrats and Republicans looking at that. They're there for different flavors of infrastructure, but the general agreement is we need to be able to provide more energy and provide it more quickly than we have over the past 30 years. There's a complex story for why electricity growth stalled in the U.S. Some of it was what we now view as economic insecurity, offshoring of manufacturing and other kinds of industry. Some of it was energy efficiency, so mix of good and bad depending on your perspective. But you need to have a system which allows more dynamism in the development of infrastructure if you want to have more dynamism when you're playing all the keys on the keyboard.
Nicely stated. Let's move to the final chapter, which is a very, very important one, which is the role of partners. And traditional trading partners, including emerging tech allies. And we touched on a few. We touched on the EU, Korea, and India as illustrative examples. We also highlighted the role of the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as important allies that are emerging. But Rick, you've been at this for a long time on India, and there have been a lot of recent developments that are quite interesting. But when it comes to giving the U.S. an added advantage as part of its long game, tell us the role that India could play or is currently playing.
Yeah, when we were thinking about partners and allies, and again, the foundation for this is the belief that you're going to have two ecosystems that continue to peel themselves apart from each other, a U.S.-led and a China-led. So that's kind of the basic construct. Who do you want to have on our side of the camp at the end of the day? And there's two features, right? Those that you need, because they have specific equipment, technology, inputs that are critical for that transition, and those that you want. You want them because India, for instance, has got a huge workforce that actually a lot of tech companies use. We may not think of India as the developer of cutting-edge tech, but they actually are a lot of times in the back office, either for American companies or for Indian major companies. So, those that you need, those that you want, and then a time frame, those that are important today and those that are important tomorrow. So we took a look at the three countries because Europe, we've got these long-standing habits of cooperation, and there's some sectors, as Sri and Mark talked about, that they're already cutting edge that we can't really do without. There you got a challenge though, which is we both have very distinct approach to all forms of regulation, and we both are absolutely sure we're right and the other's wrong, and we bludgeon each other to death across many different forums, whether it's insurance regulation, data regulation, so many other areas. So opportunities, habits of cooperation, but challenges. Korea has got this challenge between partnership versus proximity. Partnership, the depth of partnership they built with the United States across many decades now, but proximity, China's right there. And they're trying to balance a healthy economic relationship with both. India presents a unique example. We don't necessarily need India. We want India. We want them for the talent they've got as a modest market today. But there's where you got to take a stab at looking at the future. The future of India, which is a $20 trillion economy, which will increasingly be able to demand. They don't want to naturally rise to the top in emerging tech. They want to force their way through partnership with the United States and partners to get access to IP and technology. And, small countries you can say no to. But there's going to be three global powers in the future. Two are already there. India is the one that's going to take a seat. And the question is, do you wait until they're there and they can really push us around, or do you start building trust by offering tech collaboration in ways that maybe make us a little uncomfortable, but that they're kind of demanding as a way to deepen the partnership overall? And that's where being at an institution like CSIS is important, because the work I've done in U.S.-India military interoperability and collaboration, there is a lot more overlap in terms of what we got right and wrong with the ecosystem we create in military development and weapons and technology, lessons we can learn and pour it over to tech as we continue to separate, and of course a lot of things we did wrong, and try to get that right the second bite at the apple as we do set up a more contained ecosystem among friends and partners in high tech.
Awesome. As you always do, you beautifully synthesized all the aspects of that report as well as highlighted India. Thank you for that. We have a few minutes. Chris, we have a few minutes for questions to ask some of the scholars here about their topics. And obviously, we haven't been able to do justice to the depth of the work that's in the report. So I do invite you to take a look at it. And that each of them will be putting out videos that gives a synopsis of what they've done. So you could see that that's coming down the pike as well.
And nod to my co-authors too, of course, Phil Luck and Aaron Murphy, who couldn't be on stage today.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Any questions? No? All right. Well, let me say this. I thank colleagues here. We worked long and hard over several months, and this is just the commencement, not the culmination of the TechEdge work stream. This report was really to put our framework out there and demonstrate how it could be useful to policymakers. What you will expect in the next few months and years is deep dives in new technology areas like robotics, fusion, quantum, and other areas, using the same framework of trying to assess the quality of ecosystems, US versus China and their respective trading partners. So we're very excited about this work, and we hope it gives our department an ability to influence and shape the debate in ways that are productive, bipartisan, and really long-term in its orientation. So thank you for joining us today, and again, round of applause to my colleagues here.